There are people who once loved deeply but became so wounded that now they protect themselves with coldness. People who once trusted sincerely but became so disappointed that cynicism slowly replaced wonder. People who once carried compassion but became so exhausted and bitter that now they criticize everything and trust nobody. And somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing these changes as warning signs. They started seeing them as survival skills. That is one of the saddest transformations a person can experience. When dysfunction starts feeling wise, when numbness starts feeling mature, when emotional walls start feeling safer than vulnerability, and compromise starts feeling reasonable. Because once sin stops looking dangerous, people begin protecting it instead of confronting it. And people naturally protect whatever comforts them, even when that comfort is quietly destroying them. There are individuals who defend anger because anger makes them feel strong. People who defend lust because lust temporarily distracts them from what wounded him deeply years ago. A woman tells herself she is independent, but deep down she no longer trusts anyone enough to let them close because pain taught her isolation feels safer. Someone calls their constant distractions relaxing, but secretly they cannot handle silence because silence exposes how spiritually empty they have become. And the longer these patterns continue, the harder they become to recognize. Because repeated behavior slowly becomes identity. People stop saying, "I struggle with bitterness," and begin saying, "That's just how I am." They stop saying, "I've become distant from God," and begin saying, "I'm just not emotional anymore." They stop saying, "I need healing," and begin saying, "This is simply how life works." That shift is dangerous because the enemy does not need you to openly celebrate sin. He only needs you to stop resisting it honestly. And maybe that is why this message feels uncomfortable to some people. Because deep down they know they have slowly built a life around things that were supposed to remain temporary struggles. There are people who once desperately wanted freedom. Now they mostly want comfort. And comfort changes people. Comfort lowers standards quietly. Comfort weakens urgency. Comfort teaches the soul how to survive inside unhealthy spiritual conditions. Think about how this happens in everyday life. A person starts watching things they once avoided. At first, conviction speaks loudly. Then they ignore it. Eventually, they stop noticing it completely. A person begins entertaining resentment after being hurt. At first, they know bitterness is poisoning them. But over time, resentment becomes familiar company. And familiar pain often feels safer than uncertain healing. A person becomes spiritually lazy during a difficult season. At first, they assume it is temporary. But months later, they have lost all discipline and barely recognize the person they used to be. Not because they consciously chose darkness, because adaptation happens slowly. That is why the real danger is not simply falling. The real danger is adjusting to the fall. Learning how to live spiritually numb without feeling disturbed by it anymore. And maybe no example captures this more painfully than people who once burned passionately for God. Oh, people who once prayed with tears, once worshiped sincerely, once carried deep spiritual sensitivity. But slowly life happened. Pain happened. Disappointment happened. Delayed prayers happened. Exhaustion happened. And instead of bringing those wounds honestly before God, they quietly started building emotional walls. At first, those walls felt protective, reasonable even. Then those walls became permanent, and eventually the fire disappeared. Not in one dramatic moment, in tiny compromises, tiny disappointments, tiny excuses, tiny delays. Until one day they realized they were still religious outwardly, but spiritually disconnected inwardly. Still attending church, speaking the language of faith, still functioning, but no intimacy, no hunger, no urgency, only routine, only performance, only survival. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that many people do not even realize how far they have drifted, because compromise rarely feels dangerous while it is happening. It feels understandable, manageable, normal. That is why people defend it. But what you defend eventually shapes you. What you excuse eventually influences you. What you normalize eventually defines you. To come, and every time you thought you're about to come, and every time you thought you're about to come, and every time you thought you're about to come, and every time you thought you're about to come, and every time you thought you're about to come, and every time you thought you're about to come, and every time you thought you're about to come, and every time you thought you're about to come, and every time there is still a quiet awareness that something has changed. Maybe you have become comfortable with attitudes that once convicted you. Maybe you have accepted patterns that once frightened you. Maybe you have learned how to live beside things that are slowly starving your soul, not growing your sensitivity to God. Most people think the enemy's greatest weapon is destruction, cash, addiction, public failure, total collapse. They imagine spiritual warfare as something dramatic and obvious. Something loud enough that nobody could miss it. Something catastrophic enough to force attention immediately. But if you pay attention carefully, you begin to realize something unsettling. The enemy often prefers distraction over destruction. But destruction gets attention. Pain makes people pray. Heartbreak makes people desperate. Brokenness often drives people back to God. There are people who discovered the deepest moments of intimacy with God during seasons where everything in their life fell apart. When the marriage collapsed, when the diagnosis came, when the addiction became impossible to hide, when the grief became too heavy to carry alone, when the loneliness became unbearable. Pain has a strange way of stripping away illusion. It exposes what really matters. It humbles pride. It reveals dependence. Many people cry out to God most sincerely when they finally realize they cannot save themselves. But distraction works differently. Distraction numbs awareness. And numb people rarely fight for freedom because they no longer recognize how much they are losing. That is why comfortable people are spiritually vulnerable. Not because comfort itself is evil, but because comfort slowly removes urgency from the soul. And once urgency disappears, spiritual passivity quietly takes over. You stop guarding your heart carefully. Stop paying attention to compromise. Stop resisting temptation quickly. Stop noticing how distracted your life has become. And eventually the enemy no longer needs to attack you openly because your attention already belongs somewhere else. Think about modern life for a moment. Most people wake up reaching for their phone before they even speak to God, before they fully wake up emotionally, before their feet touch the floor. Notifications, headlines, messages, videos, noise, constant noise. From the moment the day begins until the moment people finally fall asleep, exhausted at night. And many people have become so overstimulated that silence now feels uncomfortable. A quiet room feels strange. Stillness feels awkward. Reflection feels exhausting because distraction trained the mind to depend on constant stimulation. There are people who cannot sit quietly for 5 minutes without reaching for something to occupy their attention. And every time you thought you're about to come for television, social media, anything to avoid stillness, anything to avoid hearing what is happening inside their own soul. And the frightening thing is that many people no longer notice how spiritually damaging this has become. It's going wrong. They simply call it normal life. But there is a difference between being busy and being spiritually alive. A person can have a full schedule and an empty soul at the exact same time. The Tom can be productive outwardly while spiritually starving inwardly. And this is happening everywhere. People are entertained but emotionally exhausted, connected online but deeply lonely, constantly stimulated but spiritually numb, always consuming but rarely reflecting, always moving but never slowing down long enough to notice what is happening inside them. That is why distraction is so dangerous, because distraction keeps people from noticing their condition. A broken person usually knows they need help, but a distracted person may drift for years without realizing how disconnected they have become. That is why the enemy does not always need your destruction. Sometimes he only needs your attention, because whenever he controls your attention, eventually shapes your spirit. And many people have slowly handed their attention away piece by piece without understanding what it was costing them. Hours disappear every day into meaningless scrolling, mindless entertainment, constant comparison, digital noise. People stare at screens until their mind feels foggy and their spirit feels drained. Then wonder why prayer suddenly feels difficult and silence feels uncomfortable. Distraction cannot nourish the soul. It can only temporarily numb awareness. That is why some people panic the moment life becomes quiet. Silence forces reflection, and reflection exposes reality. The thing revealing what distraction was hiding. The unresolved grief, the hidden bitterness. Not to compromise. When every time you thought you're about to compromise, when every time you thought you're about to compromise, when every time you thought you're about to compromise, when every time you thought you're about to compromise, when every time you thought you're about to compromise, when every time you thought you're about to compromise, when every time you thought you're about to compromise, when every time the exhaustion, the spiritual distance. And instead of facing those things in thick hole, many people immediately return to distraction because distraction feels easier than confrontation. Comfort becomes dangerous when it teaches people how to avoid their own soul. There are individuals who cannot sit through dinner without checking their phone repeatedly. People who leave the television running constantly because silence makes them uncomfortable. People who keep themselves endlessly busy because busyness prevents reflection, not because they are evil. It's because their inner world has become so neglected that stillness now feels threatening. And this is exactly why spiritual sensitivity slowly fades, because discernment requires stillness. You cannot hear conviction clearly while drowning in endless noise. You cannot recognize spiritual drift while constantly numbing yourself with distraction. You cannot cultivate intimacy with God while your attention belongs entirely to everything else. And maybe this is why some people listening feel spiritually distant lately, not because they stopped believing, not because God abandoned them, but because distractions slowly crowded out awareness. The soul weakens when it is constantly fed stimulation, but rarely fed. Eventually, spiritual disciplines begin feeling difficult. Prayer feels hard. Scripture feels dry. Vision feels mechanical. Not necessarily because God moved away, but because distraction trained the heart to crave speed instead of depth. That is one of the enemy's most effective strategies. Keep people emotionally overstimulated so they never become spiritually aware. Keep them busy enough to avoid self-examination. Keep them entertained enough to avoid repentance. Keep them distracted enough to stop fighting for intimacy with God. And sadly, many people cooperate with this without realizing it. They think exhaustion is simply adulthood. Think numbness is maturity. Think emotional shutdown is strength. Think constant busyness means they are succeeding. Meanwhile, their inner life slowly deteriorates beneath the surface. And because the decline happens gradually, they adapt to it. That word again, adapt. Human beings adapt quickly. A person can adapt to anxiety, adapt to prayerlessness, adapt to emotional emptiness, adapt to constant distraction, adapt to come to spiritual dryness. And eventually they stop expecting peace because dysfunction became familiar. That is why distracted believers are so vulnerable. A distracted believer may still know Scripture but no longer hear conviction clearly. Still attend church but no longer hunger for God sincerely. Still speak spiritual language while privately feeling emotionally disconnected. And outward appearances can hide inward exhaustion for a very long time. That is why some of the most spiritually exhausted people still look successful publicly. Beneath the surface, they are tired, deeply tired. To come not only physically, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, because living disconnected from God drains the soul slowly. And many people try to solve spiritual exhaustion with more entertainment, more noise, more busyness, more stimulation. Eventually, every distracted soul reaches moments where the emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. Maybe while driving home alone after work, maybe lying awake late at night, maybe sitting in church feeling strangely disconnected, maybe during a quiet moment where life finally slows down enough for reality to surface. And in those moments, there is often a painful realization. I have been busy for a very long time, but I have not truly been alive. About to come to this plan. That realization hurts, but it can also become the beginning of awakening, because awareness is the first step toward healing. And maybe this is why God sometimes allows discomfort, because discomfort interrupts distraction. Pain interrupts autopilot. Silence interrupts performance. Emptiness exposes what constant noise has been hiding. And perhaps some people listening right now are finally beginning to recognize what has been stealing their spiritual sensitivity. The endless scrolling, the emotional avoidance, the addiction to busyness, the constant stimulation, the refusal to slow down long enough to confront what is happening inside. None of those things may look dramatic outwardly, but spiritually they slowly weaken discernment, weaken discipline, weaken prayer, weaken intimacy. Because a distracted believer is easier to silence than a broken believer. A broken believer still cries out, still searches desperately, still knows they need God. But distracted people slowly stop noticing how desperately they need Him at all. And maybe the enemy understands something many people forget. You do not need chains around your hands if your attention is already captured somewhere else. You do not need destruction if distraction already keeps the soul asleep. And maybe this message is not here to make you afraid. Maybe it is here to make you aware. Aware of what has been numbing your spirit. Aware of what constantly steals your silence. Aware of what quietly turns spiritual passion into passive routine. Because what captures your attention eventually shapes your life. And if you are not careful, distraction will slowly convince you that surviving spiritually empty is normal. Healing sounds beautiful until it starts becoming personal. And as people love the idea of healing, they love the thought of peace returning, joy returning, freedom returning, feeling emotionally whole again, feeling spiritually alive again. People love hearing messages about restoration because deep down, everybody is tired of carrying pain, tired of surviving, tired of pretending, tired of feeling emotionally exhausted while trying to look strong for everybody else. But what many people do not realize is this: real healing is uncomfortable before it becomes peaceful, because healing is not simply comfort. Healing is confrontation. Confrontation is painful. It's not because God wants to shame people, not because He enjoys exposing weakness, but because truth must reach the wound before healing can begin. And many people have spent years hiding their wounds so deeply that they no longer know the difference between who they are and how they learn to survive. There are wounds people openly talk about. Then there are wounds people quietly build their entire personality around. Wounds hidden beneath humor, in dash and dependence, beneath busyness, beneath success, beneath religion, beneath constant distraction. There are people who learned how to smile while carrying silent heartbreak for years. People who became experts at encouraging everybody else while secretly feeling empty themselves. People who became so used to emotional survival that they no longer remember what peace actually feels like. And many do not realize how deeply wounded they are until God begins touching the exact areas they worked hardest to protect. That is why some people ask God for healing while still defending the habits, attitudes, and emotional walls that keep them broken. They want peace without surrender, freedom without honesty, transformation without discomfort. Has been dashed. When every time you thought you're about to come forth, every time you thought you're about to come forth, when every time you thought you're about to come forth, when every time you thought you're about to come forth, when every time you thought you're about to come forth, when every time you thought you're about, you cannot heal while constantly hiding. You cannot recover while protecting dysfunction. You cannot become free while defending the very chains that keep hurting you. And that truth feels heavy because many people have spent years turning pain into identity, years turning coping mechanisms into permanent lifestyles. There are people who no longer know the difference between their personality and their survival patterns. A man who was betrayed years ago now calls emotional distance wisdom. But the truth is he is terrified of vulnerability. A woman who spent years feeling overlooked now depends on constant validation because attention temporarily numbs the ache of feeling unseen. Someone who grew up surrounded by chaos now secretly fears peace because chaos became familiar. Someone who was repeatedly disappointed now isolates themselves emotionally and calls it protecting my peace, while loneliness quietly consumes them from the inside. And every time you thought you're about to come to sympathy with Chukti, pain stops feeling temporary and starts feeling normal. And eventually people begin protecting the very dysfunction that is draining them. Because familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar healing. That is one of the hardest truths for many people to accept. Some people cling to broken patterns because brokenness became predictable. And least numbness feels manageable. Least distraction keeps difficult emotions buried. And least emotional walls prevent future disappointment. Healing threatens all of that because healing forces buried things to surface. And buried pain rarely rises quietly. It rises through tears, through grief, through uncomfortable honesty, through moments where God begins revealing how exhausted the soul truly is beneath all the performance. That is why many people walk away from the healing process too early. Not because healing is impossible, but because exposure feels terrifying. Especially for people who spent years convincing everyone around them that they were fine. There are individuals listening right now who have become masters at appearing strong. You know how to smile while emotionally collapsing inside. But you know how to encourage other people while secretly feeling hopeless yourself. You know how to keep functioning professionally while privately battling exhaustion, resentment, compromise, or numbness. And after years of surviving this way, vulnerability starts feeling dangerous. Because if you stop performing strength for one moment, you are afraid everything inside you might finally spill out. So instead of becoming honest, many people stay distracted, stay busy, stay emotionally guarded, stay spiritually distant. Because pretending feels safer than confronting what has been hidden for years. But healing cannot begin until honesty becomes more important than comfort. That is the painful crossroads many people eventually reach. Will you protect the image you built? Or will you allow God to touch the places inside you that are still bleeding? Because God cannot heal the version of you that keeps hiding. He heals the honest version, the exposed version, the surrendered version. And surrender feels deeply uncomfortable for people who survive through control. Some people are addicted to control because control makes them feel safe. They plan everything carefully, manage every detail, guard every emotion because they are naturally peaceful, because deep down they are afraid. There's no sign of appeasement, afraid of being hurt again, afraid of losing stability, afraid of trusting God fully. And that fear quietly shapes their entire spiritual life. Others are addicted to attention, not always publicly, sometimes emotionally. They constantly seek affirmation because there is an emptiness inside that temporary approval helps soothe for a moment. But validation cannot heal identity wounds. Only truth can. Only God can. There are also people addicted to comfort itself. Comfortable routines, comfortable distractions, comfortable compromise, and discomfortable emotional walls. Because comfort removes immediate pressure even while slowly destroying long-term peace. That is why healing often feels painful at first. Because healing removes false comfort before restoring real peace. There comes a moment in every healing journey where a person quietly realizes, I cannot keep living this way anymore. The pain beneath the distraction, not just the bitterness, the heartbreak beneath the bitterness. That is where healing truly begins. And not at performance, at honesty. And honesty sounds spiritual until it becomes personal. Until God asks you to admit you are angry, lonely, addicted, jealous, proud, afraid, exhausted. Until He asks you to stop blaming everybody else and finally acknowledge what has been happening inside your own heart. That process feels deeply uncomfortable because many people spend years avoiding themselves. But avoidance never heals wounds. It only delays healing while the damage quietly spreads deeper. There are people praying for freedom while continuing to feed the patterns, destroying them. Praying for peace while consuming constant chaos. Praying for intimacy with God while refusing silence. Praying for healing while avoiding accountability. Praying for change while protecting pride. And eventually something has to break. Not because God is cruel, because healing requires surrender. That is why small acts of obedience matter so much. Not dramatic perfection. Small surrender. Choosing silence instead of endless distraction. Choosing prayer instead of avoidance. Choosing confession instead of performance. Choosing accountability instead of secrecy. Choosing truth instead of comfort. And at first, those decisions feel painfully unfamiliar because healing usually begins before emotions fully return. Many people expect instant transformation, but healing is often slower than that. Sometimes discipline returns before passion does. Sometimes obedience comes before feelings. Sometimes you pray while still feeling numb. Sometimes you worship while still feeling broken. Sometimes you keep showing up before your heart fully awakens again. And that does not mean healing is failing. It means healing is a process. A slow rebuilding, a gradual restoration of sensitivity, because the same soul that slowly drifted can slowly return. But return requires honesty. And honesty requires courage. The courage to stop protecting what is destroying you. The courage to admit that some of the things comforting you are also suffocating you spiritually. The courage to let God remove false peace so real peace can finally grow. And maybe this is where some people listening realize they are exhausted from carrying versions of themselves they were never meant to become. Pretending, exhausted from hiding, exhausted from managing pain instead of healing it. And maybe God is not exposing those wounds to humiliate you. Maybe He is exposing them because He no longer wants you living half awake. Because real healing does not begin when pain disappears. Real healing begins when honesty finally enters the room. One of the most dangerous lies people begin believing after a long season of spiritual numbness is this: I think I've gone too far. Too far to feel close to God again. Too far to recover what was lost. Too far to become spiritually alive again. Too far to heal. Too far to change. And if we are honest, there are many people listening right now who secretly carry that fear every single day. They sit in church services surrounded by worship and still feel emotionally distant. They hear other people talk about intimacy with God and quietly wonder why they feel empty instead of hopeful. They remember what passion used to feel like, about to come time, what spiritual sensitivity used to feel like, and that memory hurts. To come somewhere along the way, Life happened, pain happened, disappointment happened, compromise happened, exhaustion happened, distraction happened. It was arisen, and every time you thought you were about to come, parts of them went quiet, about to come out all at once, gradually. And after enough time passes, numbness starts feeling permanent. That is the dangerous part. Not simply drifting, believing you can never return, because hopelessness traps people longer than failure ever could. But a person who still believes restoration is possible will keep searching, just keep praying, keep fighting. But a person who believes they are beyond healing often stops trying completely. That is why the enemy fights so hard to convince wounded people that their story is finished. He wants them ashamed of their distance instead of honest about it. He wants them hiding instead of returning. He wants them convinced that because they slowly drifted away, restoration is no longer possible. The truth is this: you are not too far gone. Not spiritually, not emotionally, not mentally, not relationally, not even after years of compromise. Because God specializes in restoring people who thought they permanently lost themselves. There are people listening right now who barely recognize the person they became. When every time you thought you're about to come to that, you remember when your heart felt softer, when your spirit felt sensitive. Every time you thought you're about to come, when worship moved you deeply, when every hope is arisen. But now, you try to pray, but your thoughts wander constantly. You try to focus, but distraction feels stronger than discipline. You try to reconnect spiritually, but numbness interrupts the process again and again. And slowly frustration begins whispering, maybe this is just who you are now. About to come to. When every hope is arisen, and every time you thought you're about to come, things to be going wrong. When everything seems 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 to be... There are people listening to this right now who honestly believe the greatest danger in life is failure. Losing everything. Watching your world fall apart. Hitting rock bottom so hard you do not know how to stand back up again. Public embarrassment. Addiction. Divorce. Complaints. Walking completely away from faith. And yes, those things are painful. Those things destroy lives every single day. But what if the most dangerous season of your life does not look dangerous at all? What if the greatest spiritual threat is not destruction? What if it is comfort, not healthy rest, not peace that comes from God, not healing after a hard season? The kind that slowly puts your soul to sleep while your life still looks completely normal on the outside. Because the enemy does not always destroy people loudly. Sometimes he simply makes them comfortable enough to stop fighting, comfortable enough to stop praying honestly, comfortable enough to stop resisting compromise, comfortable enough to slowly lose sensitivity to the things that once troubled their spirit deeply. And that is what makes this so dangerous. You can be spiritually asleep while still looking spiritually alive to everybody around you. You can still attend church every Sunday, still smile and greet people warmly in the lobby, still post Bible verses online. Hope after hope is arisen, things seems to be going wrong. Still raise your hands during worship. Still know the right Christian language. Still look faithful from the outside. Meanwhile, deep inside, something has quietly changed. Something sacred has gone silent. You no longer feel conviction the way you once did. You no longer fight certain thoughts the way you used to. You no longer notice how distant you have become because the distance happens slowly. That is the frightening part. Visible destruction usually gets attention. People notice when someone completely falls apart. People notice addiction. People notice scandals. People notice breakdowns. People notice public failure. But invisible compromise hides itself inside normal routines. and dashed. Hope after hope is arisen, and every time you thought you're about to come down from death, inside busy schedules, inside little habits nobody questions anymore. You wake up in the morning tired before the day even begins. You grab your phone before your feet touch the floor. You check messages, scroll headlines, answer emails, rush through breakfast, fight traffic, handle responsibilities, pay bills, come home exhausted, watch television, scroll late into the night, say a quick prayer half awake before bed, then do it all over again tomorrow. And somewhere in the middle of all those normal days, your soul slowly drifts farther and farther away from the fire it once carried. Not because you stopped believing completely, not because you woke up one day determined to abandon God, but because you slowly stopped fighting carefully. There are people hearing this right now who remember when their faith felt alive, not perfect, not polished, but alive. You remember praying with tears in your eyes. You remember sitting quietly with God and actually feeling His presence deeply. You remember moments when conviction came quickly, moments when your heart felt soft, sensitive, hungry for God, hungry for truth, hungry for change. But now life feels spiritually dull, not tragic, not dramatic, just dull. And dullness is dangerous because dullness rarely alarms people. It just slowly changes them. That is how many souls drift away. To come tall, not through rebellion first, through comfort first. What if the enemy's greatest strategy is not making you evil? What if his greatest strategy is making you numb? What if he no longer needs to pull people into obvious destruction because he has already convinced them to settle into passive compromise? Think about how subtle this process really is. You stop praying deeply because you are tired. Then tired slowly becomes distracted. Distracted slowly becomes distant. Distant slowly becomes normal. And one day you realize you have not truly felt spiritually awake in a very long time. But nobody noticed, maybe not even you, because outwardly your life still functions. You still go to work, still care for your family, still show up for responsibility, still laugh during conversation, still pay the mortgage, still attend church occasionally, still survive. But surviving and being spiritually alive are not the same thing. Some people have learned how to survive while their soul quietly starves. And spiritual starvation rarely happens overnight. It happens slowly, like a room becoming darker little by little, until eventually your eyes adjust to the darkness and stop expecting light. That is what compromise does. That is what numbness does. It introduces itself softly, quietly, patiently. It whispers things like, "You're just exhausted. You've been through a lot. It's not that serious. You deserve comfort. You can deal with that later." Everybody struggles. You're still doing better than most people. And little by little, your resistance weakens. Not all at once, gradually, almost gently, until eventually the things that once disturbed your spirit no longer even catch your attention. And maybe that is why this message already feels uncomfortable to some people. Because deep down, many know exactly what this feels like. You know what it feels like to ignore conviction long enough that silence becomes easier than honesty. You know what it feels like to distract yourself instead of sitting quietly with God. You know what it feels like to stay busy because busyness keeps you from noticing how spiritually exhausted you really are. Maybe your family thinks you are fine. Maybe your church thinks you are strong. Maybe your coworkers think you are successful. Maybe people compliment your consistency and responsibility all the time. But then late at night, when the house finally becomes quiet and everybody else is asleep, there is still a part of you that knows something is missing. Not to something holy, something alive. Because comfort has a strange power. It convinces people they are safe while quietly disconnecting them from the urgency that once kept their spirit awake. Comfort says, you can pray tomorrow. You can change later. You can deal with it eventually. You're okay. But spiritual drift rarely announces itself loudly. It happens in inches. Tiny compromises, tiny excuses, tiny delays, tiny moments where the soul stops resisting. And eventually what once felt temporary becomes permanent. That is the real danger. Not falling, adapting, not weakness, acceptance, not failure, peace with failure. And maybe the reason this message feels heavy is because somewhere inside, you have made peace with things you were never supposed to live comfortably beside. Maybe it is bitterness you never released. Maybe it is pride you secretly protect. Maybe it is lust. Maybe it is emotional numbness. Maybe it is resentment. Maybe it is hopelessness. Maybe it is constant distraction. Maybe it is simply pretending that everything is okay when deep down you know it is not. But whatever it is, the danger is not simply that it exists. The danger is that it no longer disturbs you the way it once did. And if we are honest, people listening right now are no longer truly fighting. You are functioning, but not fighting, existing, but not awakening, living, but not fully alive. You have become skilled at surviving spiritually exhausted, skilled at smiling while your soul feels empty, skilled at keeping routines going while your inner life slowly fades. And maybe this message is not about condemnation at all. Maybe this is an interruption, a wake-up call, a holy discomfort sent by God before numbness becomes permanent. Maybe God is trying to show you that the enemy does not always need your destruction. Sometimes he only needs your comfort. Sometimes he only needs your permission to slowly stop resisting. And if your soul has been asleep, if your heart has become numb, if your spiritual fire has faded little by little over the years, then maybe this moment is not here to shame you. Maybe this moment is here to wake you up. The frightening thing about spiritual drift is that most people do not realize it is happening while it is happening. There is usually no dramatic moment, no loud collapse, no sudden decision where someone wakes up and says, "I'm done with God." That is rarely how it begins. Most of the time it starts quietly, almost invisibly. It begins in ordinary life, in exhaustion, in disappointment, in long seasons of stress that slowly wear down the soul little by little. And because the changes happen slowly, people adapt to them before they even recognize what is happening inside them. That is what makes comfort so dangerous. Not because comfort always looks sinful, but because comfort slowly teaches the heart how to live without urgency. At first, the changes feel small, harmless, temporary. You tell yourself you are just tired. You say life has simply been overwhelming lately. You promise yourself you will reconnect with God when things calm down, when work slows down, when the children need less from you, when your emotions settle, when your mind feels clearer, then life becomes easier. But life rarely slows down on its own. And temporary spiritual neglect has a way of becoming permanent routine. That is how drift happens, quietly, gradually, without announcement. There are people listening right now who remember when silence used to feel comforting, sacred even. You remember sitting quietly in the early morning with a cup of coffee and your Bible open before the house woke up. You remember praying while driving alone. You remember worshiping sincerely without needing to force emotion. You remember moments when your spirit felt sensitive, soft, alive. But now silence feels different. Now silence feels uncomfortable because silence forces honesty. And honesty is difficult for exhausted souls. So instead of slowing down, many people stay distracted, constantly distracted. The television stays on in the background. The phone never leaves the hand. There is always another video, and another headline, another notification, another distraction, another reason to avoid sitting still long enough to feel what is really happening inside. And maybe this sounds painfully familiar to someone listening right now. Maybe you know exactly what it feels like to lie awake late at night with your phone glowing in your face while your mind feels exhausted but restless at the same time. You keep scrolling even though you are not enjoying any of it anymore. Not because you are entertained, because distraction feels easier than silence. But you're about to come to us when it exposes loneliness, exposes anxiety, exposes disappointment, exposes spiritual distance, exposes grief that was never fully healed, exposes hidden compromise that slowly became normal. And that is one of the clearest signs of spiritual drift. You become uncomfortable with stillness because stillness begins revealing the condition of your soul. There are people who are not addicted to entertainment itself. They are addicted to avoiding themselves, avoiding what they feel, avoiding what they lost, avoiding how empty they have become spiritually. And every time you thought you're about to become time is small. They stop feeling close to God the way they once did. And slowly, over time, this emotional avoidance becomes routine. And then routine becomes lifestyle. Then lifestyle becomes identity. That is how compromise quietly settles into a person's life, not all at once, one small layer at a time. You stop prayer deeply because you are exhausted. Then eventually you stop praying honestly. Then prayer becomes rushed, mechanical, routine. Words spoken without real connection. You still pray before meals. Still pray before bed sometimes. Still say spiritual things publicly. But deep down, you know something changed. The hunger is gone. The urgency faded. When the tenderness disappeared little by little. And maybe the saddest part is this. Many people continue functioning normally while their soul quietly fades in the background. They still go to church, still sing worship songs, still serve others, still smile, still look fine. They feel disconnected from the very peace they speak about publicly. That internal disconnect becomes exhausting because pretending drains people. It's not feigned drains people. Acting spiritually alive while privately feeling spiritually numb creates a weariness many people never talk about openly. There are people who know how to sound faithful while secretly feeling distant from God. People who know how to encourage everybody else while privately fighting emptiness themselves. People who look emotionally stable outwardly while inwardly carrying quiet hopelessness they do not know how to explain. Then instead of becoming honest about it, many simply become busier. Because busyness can temporarily hide spiritual exhaustion. And as long as life stays loud, people can avoid noticing how empty they feel inside. That is why some people panic the moment life slows down. The moment the house becomes quiet. The moment they sit alone in the car after work. The moment they lie awake at night without distraction. Because stillness removes the noise that normally keeps reality buried. And reality can feel terrifying when a soul has been neglected for a long time. That is why spiritual decline rarely feels dramatic in the beginning. It feels manageable, normal even. You become emotionally numb to things that once convicted you. You tolerate attitudes that once disturbed you. You justify habits that once pushed you toward prayer. Not immediately, like adjusting to darkness in a room 1 minute at a time. At first, you notice the darkness clearly. Then eventually your eyes adapt. That is exactly what compromise does. It teaches people how to coexist with spiritual distance without feeling alarmed by it anymore. And many people are doing that right now without realizing how dangerous it is. Still attending church while emotionally exhausted, when still listening to sermons while privately carrying bitterness, still worshiping publicly while secretly feeling empty, still posting encouraging words online while privately struggling to feel hope themselves. And the frightening part is that nobody around them may notice, because spiritual drift often hides beneath successful routines. A person can look disciplined outwardly while inwardly feeling completely disconnected from God. A person can lead others while quietly losing themselves. A person can sound spiritually mature while secretly feeling spiritually dry. That is why shame becomes part of the cycle. People become afraid to admit what is happening. afraid someone will judge them, afraid someone will misunderstand them, afraid they will disappoint others. So instead of seeking healing, they become better performers, better at pretending, better at hiding, better at smiling through exhaustion. Meanwhile, the numbness deepens because every ignored conviction becomes easier to ignore the next time. At first, the soul protests loudly. At first, compromise still feels uncomfortable. But eventually, after enough delay, the conviction becomes quiet. Not because God stopped speaking. And every time you thought you're about to come to sting, but that's just, and maybe this is where some people begin to realize something painful. Numbness does not always come from rebellion. Sometimes it comes from exhaustion, from disappointment, from years of carrying pain without healing. There are people who became spiritually distant after prayers they felt were unanswered, after heartbreak they never recovered from, after betrayals that quietly hardened their heart, after losses they buried beneath responsibility and routine, and slowly disappointment turned into distance, not intentionally, not rebelliously, just gradually, because tired souls often search for comfort before they search for truth, and comfort slowly teaches people how to survive without intimacy. That is why spiritual drift feels so human. Most people never intend to become numb. They simply become weary, then distracted, then distant, then adapted, until one day they realize they have been calling survival peace, calling numbness maturity, calling emotional shutdown strength, calling distance normal. But deep inside, there is still an ache that refuses to disappear completely. A quiet ache reminding you that you were created for more than this half-awake existence, because your soul remembers what closeness with God once felt like. Your spirit remembers what conviction sounded like. Your heart remembers what spiritual hunger felt like before comfort slowly replaced it. And maybe that ache inside you is not condemnation. Maybe it is mercy. Maybe it is God gently revealing that your numbness does not have to become permanent, because people rarely wake up one day and suddenly abandon faith. Things seems to be going wrong. When everything seems to be going wrong, and every time you thought you're about to comfort, the tempt comfort is dangerous because it teaches people how to live disconnected without realizing what they are losing until the emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. There is something deeply frightening about the human heart, not because it is weak, not because it struggles, not because people fail. Every human being struggles. Every person falls short. Every soul battles weakness in one way or another. That is not the terrifying part. The terrifying part is how easily people adapt. Human beings can adapt to almost anything, even unhealthy things, even painful things, even spiritual darkness. That is why the greatest danger is often not the first moment you fall. It is the moment the fall stops bothering you. Because whatever you continue to tolerate eventually starts feeling normal. And whatever becomes normal slowly begins shaping your identity. At first, compromise feels uncomfortable. Your conscience reacts quickly. Your spirit feels unsettled. There is tension inside you. Conviction still speaks loudly. You still notice when something feels wrong. You still feel the grief of disappointing God. But over time, if conviction keeps getting ignored, something slowly changes inside the soul. The voice becomes quieter, not because God stopped speaking, but because repeated compromise trained the heart not to listen carefully anymore. That is how numbness deepens, quietly, gradually, one ignored conviction at a time. And eventually, the real danger is no longer simply the sin itself. The real danger is becoming emotionally at peace with it. Because once you make peace with something destructive, you stop fighting it honestly. And whatever you stop fighting eventually gains influence over your life. At first, you resist bitterness. Then you explain bitterness. When every time you thought you're about to compliment its path, when everything seems to be going wrong, when everything seems to be going wrong, then bitterness slowly becomes part of your personality. At first, pride feels ugly. Then pride starts feeling protective, necessary even. Then eventually pride becomes the armor you hide behind every day. At first, isolation feels temporary. Then isolation begins feeling safe, comfortable, predictable. Then one day you realize loneliness has become your permanent hiding place. That is how spiritual drift changes people. Not through dramatic rebellion first, through quiet agreement, through internal permission, through learning how to live beside things that were once supposed to disturb your spirit deeply. And if we are honest, many people listening already know exactly what this feels like. You remember when certain habits convicted you immediately. Now they barely affect you at all. You remember when certain conversations bothered your spirit. Now they feel ordinary. You remember when you used to pray after falling into temptation. Now sometimes you move on without even thinking about it. Not because you intentionally planned to become numb, but because repeated compromise slowly reshaped your sensitivity. And the frightening thing is that this process happens gradually enough that most people do not realize who they are becoming until they feel completely disconnected from the person they used to be. That healing does not happen in one emotional moment. And spiritual identity is rarely rebuilt overnight. That is important to understand because many people quit too early. They expect one prayer to instantly erase years of drift. One emotional church service to suddenly restore passion. Breakthrough moment to immediately heal every wound inside them. But restoration usually happens slower than that. To come prouder than that. More gradually than that. And dashed. And every time you thought you're about to come, they often mistake slow healing for failed healing. Imagine someone who spent years neglecting their physical health. Years eating poorly. Years exhausting their body, years avoiding movement. They would not expect one visit to the gym to suddenly restore strength overnight. Recovery takes time, consistency, your patience, daily decisions. The same thing is true spiritually. A soul that slowly drifted often heals slowly too. And at first, that can feel discouraging. Because there are seasons where discipline returns before emotions do. You begin praying again, but it still feels awkward. You begin reading scripture again, but passion has not fully returned yet. You begin choosing silence over distraction, but your mind still feels restless and noisy. And during those moments, many people assume nothing is changing, but something is changing quietly, deeply. Because healing often begins beneath the surface long before emotions fully catch up. That is why consistency matters so much. Not dramatic perfection. Consistency. Small acts of surrender repeated daily. Choosing honesty. Choosing prayer. Choosing truth. Choosing obedience. Choosing to stay present with God even while parts of your heart still feel numb. Those small decisions slowly rebuild spiritual sensitivity, slowly restore hunger, slowly awaken identity again. Maybe that sounds too simple to some people, but most transformation in life happens quietly before it becomes visible publicly. A tree grows underground long before fruit appears above the surface. The same is true for spiritual restoration. God often rebuilds people in hidden ways first. Slowly changing desires, slowly softening bitterness, slowly restoring peace, slowly reviving conviction, slowly rebuilding trust. And then one day people suddenly realize, I don't feel as empty as I used to. Not because healing happened instantly, because they kept returning consistently. There are ordinary people everywhere carrying stories like this. A father spent years emotionally distant from his family because stress, disappointment, and exhaustion slowly hardened him over time. He still provided financially, still paid bills, still handled responsibilities, but emotionally he disappeared years earlier. One evening he sat at the dinner table listening to his children laugh with each other while barely speaking to him at all. And suddenly he realized something painful. His family knew his rules better than they knew his heart. That realization, then every time you thought you're about to come at all, not you're about to come. The next morning he woke up earlier than usual and sat alone at the kitchen table before work. Comfy growing cold beside him, about to come, silence filling the room. At first he did not even know what to pray. They kept showing up, morning after morning, till slowly his heart softened again. Slowly patience returned. Slowly his presence returned. To come perfection, presence. A woman spent years numbing herself through constant busyness after heartbreak shattered her trust. She filled every moment with work, responsibilities, noise, and distraction because slowing down meant facing grief she never fully healed from. People admired her productivity, complimented her strength, but secretly she was exhausted, spiritually empty, disconnected from herself, disconnected from God. One night after another long, exhausting day, she sat alone in her living room with the television playing softly in the background and suddenly realized she had no idea who she had become anymore. That honesty became the beginning of restoration, not instant transformation. Process. She started creating quiet moments again, started journaling honestly, just started praying simple prayers again, sometimes only a few sentences, sometimes through tears, sometimes feeling absolutely nothing at all. But over time, the numbness slowly began breaking, not dramatically, gradually. And maybe that is what some people need to hear right now. Healing is still happening even when it feels slow. You are not failing because restoration is taking time. You are rebuilding, and rebuilding always looks less dramatic than collapse. Collapse happens quickly. Restoration happens patiently, brick by brick, decision by decision. That is why you cannot measure healing only by emotion. Some days you will feel inspired. Other days you will feel tired. Some days passion will return strongly. Other days discipline alone will carry you forward. But neither season means God abandoned you. Growth is rarely linear. Even spiritually healthy people experience difficult seasons. The difference is they keep returning instead of surrendering to numbness permanently. And maybe the most beautiful part of restoration is this: God does not ask you to become perfect before coming back to Him. To stop pretending, to stop pretending, to stop pretending compromise, then to stop making peace with spiritual emptiness. You do not need flawless faith to begin again. You only need willingness to return. Willingness to confront what has been numbing your soul. Willingness to believe that God still restores exhausted people, distracted people, compromised people, wounded people, spiritually dry people. Because your identity was never meant to be built around your worst season. Your numbness is not your final identity. Your compromise is not your final identity. Your exhaustion is not your final identity. Your failure is not your final identity. God still restores sensitivity, still restores purpose, still restores hunger, still restores peace, still restores people who thought they permanently lost themselves. And maybe this moment is not about becoming someone entirely different. Maybe it is about becoming alive again, because the person you were before the numbness is not completely gone. The fire may have dimmed. The passion may have weakened. The sensitivity may have faded, but buried things can still breathe again. Dry places can still live again. And the soul that slowly drifted away can slowly find its way home again. To hope and answered when everything seems to be going wrong. When everything seems to be going wrong. To come about advises many people, because when people think about spiritual warfare, they usually imagine obvious temptation, because major failure, public collapse, addiction, chaos, something loud, something visible, things seems to be going wrong, something impossible to ignore. But many of the most important battles in a person's life happen quietly inside ordinary routines. inside habits, inside thought, inside private decisions nobody else sees. This is why many people are losing battles they do not even realize they are fighting, because the war is not always happening during catastrophic moments. Sometimes it is happening during normal Tuesday mornings, the summer long drives to work. Thought you're about to come to that. During the little choices repeated every single day until those choices slowly shape the direction of the soul. What you repeatedly feed your mind matters. What you constantly tolerate matters. What you excuse matters. What captures your attention matters. Because eventually daily habits become spiritual environments. And environments shape people more deeply than most realize. A person who constantly feeds fear eventually struggles to feel peace. A person who constantly feeds bitterness eventually loses tenderness. A person who constantly fills their mind with noise eventually struggles to hear conviction. A person who repeatedly avoids honesty eventually loses sensitivity to truth. And none of this usually happens overnight. That is why it feels so subtle. You do not suddenly wake up spiritually exhausted one morning, then you slowly become exhausted through repeated patterns over time. One distracted day becomes one distracted month. One compromised habit becomes one compromised lifestyle. The one ignored conviction becomes years of emotional numbness. And eventually people wonder why they no longer feel spiritually alive while continuing to feed the exact patterns draining them every day. There are people listening right now who desperately want peace but constantly consume chaos. They wake up anxious and immediately absorb more noise, more bad news, more comparison, more outrage, more distraction, then wonder why their mind feels restless all the time. But whatever repeatedly enters your spirit eventually influences your emotional condition. That is why daily habits matter so deeply. Not because God expects perfection, because repeated choices quietly shape identity. A person who constantly feeds lust weakens discipline over time. A person who constantly feeds fear weakens trust over time. A person who constantly feeds distraction weakens spiritual awareness over time. What you repeatedly meditate on eventually grows stronger inside you. That is why victory is rarely dramatic. Real transformation usually happens quietly inside ordinary routines. Inside mornings, inside private moments, inside decisions nobody applauds. And this is where many people misunderstand spiritual growth. They keep waiting for one giant breakthrough while ignoring the daily habits either healing or harming them every single day. But freedom is rarely built in one emotional moment. Freedom is usually built through repeated obedience, then repeated honesty, repeated surrender. That sounds less exciting, less dramatic, but it is true. There are people who want spiritual intimacy while refusing silence, want peace while constantly feeding anxiety, want healing while avoiding accountability. And every hope is arisen, and every hope is arisen, and eventually frustration grows because they want transformation without changing the environment their soul lives in every day. But healing requires new rhythms, boundaries, new habits. That is why rebuilding spiritual life often begins with very ordinary decisions. Creating silence again, turning the phone off for a while, sitting alone with God honestly, prayer being, and every time you reading scripture slowly instead of rushing through it mechanically, paying attention to what constantly drains your peace, paying attention to what awakens temptation, paying attention to what emotionally numbs you. These things matter because spiritual drift often hides inside routines people stopped questioning long ago. A person spends 5 hours every night consuming endless content online, but gives God 5 distracted minutes and wonders why intimacy feels distant. Another person surrounds themselves constantly with negativity, gossip, cynicism, and emotional chaos, then wonders why hope feels weak inside them. Someone keeps entertaining compromise privately while publicly praying for spiritual strength. And eventually, internal conflict becomes exhausting because the soul cannot stay healthy inside environments that constantly poison it. That truth sounds strong, but it is deeply practical. You become shaped by what repeatedly surrounds you. That is why the enemy fights so hard for your attention, because attention eventually becomes affection. And every time you thought you're about to come to full, if distraction consumes your attention long enough, the spiritual hunger weakens. If bitterness consumes your attention long enough, compassion weakens. If fear consumes your attention long enough, courage weakens. What repeatedly fills your mind eventually influences the direction of your heart. That is why guarding your inner life matters so much. Not fearfully, not legalistically, but wisely. Because many people unknowingly build lifestyles that slowly suffocate their spirit. And the frightening part is that modern culture often rewards those unhealthy rhythms. Constant busyness gets praised. Overworking gets admired. Emotional numbness gets called being strong. Isolation gets mistaken for independence. When everything's people celebrate survival while quietly ignoring the condition of their soul. Meanwhile, exhaustion deepens, purpose fades, sensitivity weakens, and many people no longer remember what spiritual clarity even feels like anymore. That is why silence becomes so important. Not empty silence, intentional silence. Moments where you stop running from yourself long enough to hear what is happening inside. Then dashed, hopeless. Many people are terrified of stillness. Stillness reveals things, reveals exhaustion, reveals hidden grief, reveals compromise, reveals anxiety, reveals spiritual hunger, that distraction buried beneath noise. But silence also creates room for healing, room for conviction, room for clarity, room for God to speak again beneath all the noise. That is why rebuilding spiritual health requires creating space intentionally. Not waiting until life magically slows down one day. Choosing stillness on purpose. Choosing prayer intentionally. Choosing healthier rhythms consistently. And yes, at first, those decisions feel difficult because habits shape desires over time. And a distracted mind struggles with stillness initially. And every time you thought you're about to come time because one wall. A spiritually exhausted soul struggles with discipline initially. Difficulty does not mean failure. It means retraining, relearning how to live awake again. Think about physical strength for a moment. A person who has been inactive for years feels discomfort when they begin exercising again. Not because movement is wrong, because neglected muscles need rebuilding. The same thing happens spiritually. Prayer feels difficult at first because attention has been scattered for too long. Stillness feels uncomfortable because the soul became dependent on stimulation. Honesty feels painful because performance became familiar. But every small act of obedience strengthens sensitivity again. Every honest prayer matters. Every moment of silence matters. Every decision to resist distraction matters. Every act of surrender matters. Not dramatically, gradually. And over time, those small daily decisions begin changing a person from the inside out. Peace slowly returns. Clarity slowly returns. Discipline slowly returns. Sensitivity slowly returns. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, because the soul slowly becomes healthier. And maybe this is where many people need to stop waiting for motivation before choosing obedience. Because motivation comes and goes, feelings rise and fall. But daily habits quietly determine direction over time. A person does not accidentally become spiritually alive. It is all. Just like a person does not accidentally become spiritually numb. Both are shaped through repeated choices, repeated environments, repeated attention. That is why this battle is happening inside ordinary life, inside routines nobody else sees. And every time you thought you're about to conversations within your own mind, inside what you repeatedly allow your spirit to consume, inside the little decisions you make when nobody is watching. Maybe that sounds overwhelming at first, but there is hope in it too. Because if daily habits help create numbness, daily habits can also help rebuild sensitivity. The small obedience still matters. Small discipline still matters. Small moments of honesty still matter. You do not need to transform your entire life overnight. You simply need to stop feeding the things quietly destroying your soul. And maybe this is where real awakening begins. Now, in dramatic performance, in daily surrender, in ordinary faithfulness, in quiet decisions repeated consistently until the soul slowly learns how to breathe deeply again. Because victory is rarely built in one giant emotional moment. It is built quietly through daily decisions nobody else sees. There is a cost to spiritual numbness, a real cost, not always immediate, not always obvious, not always dramatic enough for other people to notice. But over time, comfort slowly takes things from people. Years, peace, sensitivity, purpose, closeness with God, clarity, identity, joy. And perhaps the saddest part is that many people do not realize what they are losing until the emptiness becomes impossible. That is the frightening power of gradual drift. You rarely notice it while it is happening. A little less prayer, a little more distraction, when every time you thought you're about to come dash, a little more compromise, a little less hunger, a little more numbness. And eventually, a person wakes up realizing they have been surviving spiritually instead of truly living. Still functioning, still smiling, is still going to work, still handling responsibilities, still showing up for everybody else, but inwardly disconnected from the life they once carried. There are people listening right now who remember when they felt spiritually awake. Not perfect, not flawless, but alive. You remember moments when worship moved you deeply, moments when conviction came quickly, moments when prayer felt real instead of routine, moments when your heart felt soft instead of guarded, moments when your soul carried expectation instead of exhaustion. And maybe what hurts most is realizing how slowly those things faded, not suddenly, quietly, through years of stress, pain, disappointment, distraction, compromise, emotional survival. And now somewhere inside you there is a grief you rarely talk about openly. The grief of becoming someone you never intended to become, because nobody plans to drift spiritually. Nobody dreams of becoming numb. Nobody hopes to lose sensitivity to God. It happens gradually while trying to survive life. That is why this message is not about condemnation. It is about awakening. Because the enemy does not always need your destruction. He only needs your permission to stay asleep. That is all. If he can keep you distracted, spiritually passive, emotionally numb, constantly busy, endlessly stimulated, a sleeping soul rarely fights for freedom. And maybe this is why some people feel uncomfortable listening to this message. Because deep down they know they have adapted to things that once would have broken their heart. Adapted to prayerlessness. Adapted to emotional distance. The time you thought you're about to compromise. Adapted to constant distraction. Adapted to surviving without intimacy with God. And adaptation is dangerous because whatever becomes normal eventually stops feeling urgent. That is why people can live spiritually dry for years while convincing themselves everything is fine. Because outwardly life still functions, bills still get paid, work still gets done, responsibilities still get handled, people still compliment them. But inwardly something sacred has gone quiet. And perhaps some people have spent so long managing appearances that they no longer know how to be honest about their coke. You learned how to perform strength, how to smile politely, how to say all the right spiritual phrases, how to appear emotionally stable. Meanwhile, inside, your soul feels exhausted, and maybe nobody around you fully understands how tired you really are. Not physically only, spiritually. Tired you pretending, tired of carrying hidden emptiness, tired you distracting yourself from the ache that keeps returning whenever life becomes quiet. But maybe that ache is not punishment. Maybe it is mercy, because numbness would be far more dangerous if you no longer felt anything at all. The fact that something inside you still aches for more may actually be proof that God is still calling you back, still calling your heart awake again. Because despite everything this message has exposed, there is no sign of a prayer that is about to come be good, you may be saying, not emotional hype, hope. Because spiritual numbness is not permanent unless you choose to remain there. Your sensitivity can return. Your hunger can return. Your peace can return. Your intimacy with God can return. Your purpose is not dead. Your identity is not beyond restoration. Even if you have drifted for years, even if compromise became familiar, even if distraction consumed your attention, even if wounds hardened parts of your heart, God still restores people. That is what He has always done. He restores exhausted people, distracted people, compromised, wounded people, people who thought they permanently lost themselves. And restoration usually begins with honesty, not performance, not pretending. Honesty, the courage to admit, I'm tired, I've drifted, I've made peace with things that are destroying me. I don't want to live spiritually asleep anymore. That kind of honesty changes people, because healing begins where pretending ends. And perhaps some people listening right now are standing at a crossroads, not publicly. The path continues the cycle. It's not more distraction, more numbness, more compromise, more emotional avoidance, more surviving without truly living. The other path is slower, harder, more honest, but it leads back to life, back to sensitivity, back to intimacy with God, back to purpose, back to peace. And no, that path will not always feel dramatic. Some days it will simply look like small obedience, a quiet prayer before work in the morning, turning the phone off for a while, sitting alone with God honestly instead of endlessly distracting yourself, reading scripture slowly instead of rushing through it, confessing hidden struggles instead of pretending everything is fine, learning how to feel again, learning how to trust again, learning how to fight again. Because awakening rarely happens all at once. Sometimes it begins with one small decision. I don't want to stay asleep anymore. And maybe that is the real question now. Asked, not whether you have drifted, not whether you struggle, not whether you became numb in certain areas. The real question is this: will you stay there? Will you continue making peace with the things quietly draining your soul? Or will you finally become honest enough to let God wake you up again? What have you normalized that once convicted you? What distractions have been stealing your spiritual sensitivity? What emotional wounds have you protected instead of healed? What habits have quietly shaped your identity? What would happen if you fully awakened again? What would happen if your heart became soft again? What would happen if your passion returned? What would happen if you stopped surviving and started truly living again? Because maybe this is not the moment God is condemning you. Maybe this is the moment He is interrupting your numbness before it becomes permanent. Maybe this is the moment He is calling you out of passive survival and back into spiritual life. Maybe this is the moment He is reminding you that comfort is expensive, that distraction is costly, that compromise slowly steals things you cannot easily replace, but also that restoration is still possible, even now, especially now, and perhaps somewhere deep inside your soul, beneath all the exhaustion, distraction, fear, compromise, and numbness. There is still a quiet part of you that remembers what it felt like to be spiritually alive. That part is not dead. Buried is not the same as dead. A dim fire can still burn again. A weary soul can still breathe again. A numb heart can still soften again. A distracted life can still become focused again. You are not beyond restoration. You thought you're about to come free. You are not beyond awakening. But awakening begins with honesty. And honesty begins the moment you stop making peace with what is quietly destroying you. Maybe this is not the moment God is condemning you. Maybe this is the moment He's trying to wake you up.